Alright, today we are going to do a little bit on Weber and some more contemporary theorists. Okay, let's see, what should we start with? So right here on the web page you can see from Wiki we have Weber. Here's Weber, that's a younger picture of him. He was a German sociologist who was writing, he was born in 1864, so you'll notice he was just a child when Marx was writing, and he lived till 1920, so he was quite a bit older than Marx when all this went down. Nevertheless, a lot of his writing can be understood as a response to Marx. Okay, let's go over here. Not there. Not there. There. Okay. So earlier in the chapter, they talk about wealth, power, and prestige, and that's the way I usually present inequality as a multivariate model. You've got wealth, you've got power, and you've got prestige, and those are three different ways that you can be unequal and have some influence upon society. Okay, well, that multivariate model, you'll notice, isn't Marxist, because Marx's whole model is own or not own. That multivariate model is influenced from Weber, who has class, status, and party. So class ends up being very similar to what Marx, that's their socioeconomics, where they are. And people who are higher up are a higher class, right? You understand that discussion. People who are lower, they're low class. You're like a school in summer, you got no class. All right. Now, status is a status. Weber talks about as it says here, lifestyle. I'm trying to think of a good example, and one of the examples that comes to mind is. Remember a couple of months ago when Gwyneth Paltrow decided she was going to try and live her life on food stamps salary, food stamps allotment, and it just couldn't happen, right? If you want to eat like a good vegan princess out in Hollywood, it takes an awful lot of money. Now, people aren't going to talk about the food you choose and the life you lead as a class issue. Usually, it's a lifestyle issue, but you'll notice it's a lifestyle issue that's very much rooted in class. Sometimes I like to think of it in terms of outdoor sports. If you go to an REI up in Atlanta, it's got all these outdoor sports toys to buy for it, and it's kind of expensive, and it's got bikes, and it's got rock climbing stuff, and it's got kayaking, and if it's got fishing, it's usually offshore or fly fishing. And then you go to Bass Pro up in Macon, and it's also got outdoor sports. It's also got expensive toys, but it tends to be a different lineup of sports. And while you might say, well, your sports are either outdoor sports like climbing and paddling and boating or cycling, or they're outdoor sports like fishing and hunting, and just act like it's a lifestyle choice, when in fact one sure is much more concentrated among the professional classes, and one is more concentrated among the working classes, right? So you're not trained to see it as a status difference, but it kind of is. Okay, now party down here, political rank, what he's trying to get at here is what I earlier was talking about in terms of political power, because politics is how power is distributed throughout society, and ultimately political power is based on physical power, right? Therefore, how far up you are in the political rank means that you have some sway and influence over people. Okay, so that's Weber. Weber didn't sit around wondering whether or not you could have equality the way Marx appears to have. Weber just assumed inequality was going to exist, and that was that. He didn't spend a lot of time dreaming about some world where there would be no inequality. Okay, now, in order to truly understand Weber, you have to understand that his first and foremost issue, like if you're going to try and bullet point Weber, you'd have to hit rationality. His most of his sociology, and he wrote about everything, was about rationality progressing through all social systems. So rationality entering the economy starts looking a lot like modern capitalism. Rationality entering government looks a lot like bureaucracy and constitutions and votes, and less like one king murdering another king. Rationality entering religion looks a lot less like a cult or a thing where people follow a very charismatic person, and much more like an established church with rules and regulations and offices. So that's his whole thing. So when he starts to talk about inequality, or if we want to understand a Weberian take on inequality, we really have to recognize how that inequality is exacerbated or expressed through this rationality influencing everything else. Okay, so the first one here, bureaucracy. For Weber's understanding of rationality in social systems is bureaucracy. We all understand bureaucracies. Middle Georgia State is an enormous bureaucracy that's ensconced within the Board of Regents University System of Georgia, which is a huge bureaucracy, which itself is a part of the Georgia State government, which is absolutely tremendous. Now, some of the key components of bureaucracy is it doesn't really matter the individual who holds a specific office. The individuals are largely replaceable. We need the person in the office to do what that office does. If they don't do it, then we can get rid of them. But if they can do it and we don't like them, we don't care, because they can do that job in the office. This is, yeah, there you go. The needs and responsibilities of those offices are clearly defined. Everything's written down somewhere. Of course, nowadays it's not written down on paper, but it's in a computer database somewhere. There are codes, rules that you have to follow. Everything's, there you go, that's a bureaucracy. Now, authority is the legitimate expression of power. So let me use that. Let me give an example so that makes sense. If we go and see if I punch my neighbor in the nose, that's an unacceptable expression of violence, because I have no authority to punch someone in the nose. If a cop shows up on a scene and is trying to subdue a suspect, the cop may have the authority to punch him in the nose. So the cop can express that power, and because it's legitimate, that is authority. I can express power over my neighbor by punching him in the nose, but that's not legitimate because I don't have any authority to do so. Now, physical power is just the most extreme example of this. Anytime you're talking about enforcing a contract, there's power flowing through legitimate authority there. Or even a parent telling a child what to do, right? Hopefully you're not beating the child to make him or her clean up his room, but the parent does have the legitimate authority in that relationship to say, I need you to clean up your room, right? Okay. So legal rational authority is most easily understood as modern types of authority. So the police don't get to punch anybody in the nose. They only get to punch people in the nose in these birds are ridiculously noisy, stupid birds. They only get to punch people in the nose in very strictly defined situations, right? And how that is set up is through a legitimate government, right? So in a legitimate government, you have a set of rules. We have a constitution. We have state constitutions. We have all of the stacks and stacks of law books that go along with those constitutions. And then when we enact, among the other things that those constitutions say, is they say how the state's going to be set up, how power is going to be distributed, and how leaders are going to be appointed. And we appoint our leaders through elections. And elections are like a great big, volleyball game or something. Here's the rules. Here's how you play. Everybody plays along. If there's a foul, you call them on it, throw them out of the game. And regardless of who wins, if they've played according to the rules, then you say, okay, that person counts. If you don't like the result, you're not allowed to just throw out the winner because you feel like it. If you don't like the result, you have to go back and either train your team to play better, get a better candidate, or actually change the rules. And that's what the constitutions are for, is to build those rules. Okay? So legal rational authority is authority that's distributed through a system like we're talking about here. Now this is different than traditional. If we go back to the feudal example, who gets to be king is, on the one hand, decided by simply who gets to claim power and hold on to power. So that means that they have, that might mean that they're warlords, that they've taken more territory and more peasants by killing the leadership of the other groups. And then when that king starts to get old, how is that power passed on? Well, that power is passed on, it goes to his eldest son. Why? Because that's just the way it's done. It's traditional. So if you're talking about any group of people, from the smallest tribe to the largest, to medieval England, if you've got a family who traditionally runs things and the leadership comes from those families, that's a traditional kind of arrangement. All right. Now, the charismatic authority is the most individual oriented. All right. So in a system of traditional authority, you can have good kings and you can have bad kings, and they rule until they're killed or till the throne gets passed on. Right, like Game of Thrones. Okay. But in a situation of charismatic authority, you have a person whose leadership comes solely from the power of their personality. Okay, and if we leave God out of the equation, the early Christians are a great example of charismatic authority. Jesus was just so awesome that people wanted to stop what they were doing and hang out with him. And if he said, "Look, we're going to have a revolution," people would follow him because he was Jesus, right? He was just that awesome. If we now in a small environment like an emergent church, the person who starts it has to have a lot of charisma. They have to have a lot of charismatic authority, because in a small environment, you just need to get people to agree to follow you. But there's a point where, as any social institution, social group grows, where charisma is not enough anymore, and you have to start moving over to written codes, to legal definitions of things, and that's when you make the move from charismatic authority to a rational authority or a bureaucratic authority. So if we want to use the Christian example, now we're looking at 500 years, of course, but you go from Jesus, who is a central charismatic figure that people want to hang out with just because he's so awesome, to 498, when Christianity becomes the official church of Rome. What happens in that situation is Rome you've got, by that point, you've got offices, you've got leadership, you've got rules, you've got ways to get excommunicated, and none of that existed when Jesus started. Jesus was a charismatic authority. If you think about a startup company that moves from a startup company is a good example. When a startup company starts, it's good to have someone who has enough charisma to drive people, and you don't necessarily have an awful lot of differentiation within the company. You might have 5 employees, 10 employees, and all of them do a little bit of everything, right? Their roles aren't clearly defined as they would be in a bureaucracy, because there's simply so much to do, and that people can do them. People have to do a whole bunch of different things. Similarly, the importance of the leader in a startup in having a good vision, being good at talking to investors, being good at helping people get product out the door, and being good at using that charisma for the sales end, a lot of that rests upon a cult of personality, right? The charisma of that individual, the individual leader of that bureaucracy, that business, that entrepreneurial startup. Now, as that thing grows, there's a point, and it happens fairly quickly. It's long before you hit 100 people, closer to 50. But as that thing grows, at some point, it doesn't work when everybody sort of does everything, and the success relies upon the charisma and success of that charismatic leader. And so as the thing grows, it gets more and more bureaucratized, so that sales is done by people who specialize in account management, and marketing is done by people who specialize in marketing, and whatever the thing you do is done by people who are excellent at doing that thing. Management ends up being run by professional managers, and on and on and on down the line. And so you end up, again, if we similar to the Christian example, you go from, hey, here's an awesome guy who's going to help us make a lot of money, and there's 12 of us who are a part of this, and isn't this exciting, to Roman Catholicism in 500 AD, when you had a boss, middle managers, rules, sales, someone making widgets on the floor, all the way through. Okay, so that's now the reason that this matters, if I'm going to sum up this slide a lot, you'll notice all of this understanding of bureaucracy, authority, charisma, all of it helps capture that people are in different situations in terms of inequality, right? So the higher up you are in a system, the better off you are, right? I mean, that's the very definition of inequality. If you're a senior manager versus a middle manager, or versus a factory floor worker, those are all different layers of inequality, right? And similarly, a person with a lot of charisma can be at the top, and a person with a lot of charisma can succeed inside of our systems because of that charisma, but charisma is not the whole story. Okay, so this is just to wrap it up a little bit, but as I said before, what Weber does is he gives this multivariate understanding. So it's not just money, it's not just ownership, it's not just political power. It actually zeroes in on all sorts of different elements. And as you look through the book, as I know you've skimmed it already, but as you skim through the book, you'll notice that the whole discussion of race and gender relies upon this understanding. So here's just a hypothetical question. If there were no wealth differences by race, then would there still be inequality? If there were no wealth differences by gender, would there still be inequality? For Marx, the answer would be no. But Weber, in Weber's model, it allows that the answer might be yes. It's not a given, but at least it might be. All right. Now, Dahrendorf we've already talked a little bit we've already talked about this a little bit in the last two discussions with Weber and with Marx. But what's emerging here is that a simple understanding of who owns and who works for isn't quite enough in understanding inequality in the modern world. So in a world where we've got these enormous institutions that control almost everything, very few people actually own those institutions, and in some cases those institutions aren't really even owned in a meaningful way by anyone you can pinpoint. If Berkshire Hathaway owns owns Tesla, they don't, but roll with me. If Berkshire Hathaway owns Tesla and Tesla's making all sorts of money, that's great for Berkshire Hathaway, but Berkshire Hathaway is just a holding company, and it itself is spread through stock through a zillion different people. So who actually matters there? Is it me as the individual stockholder because I own part of it? Well, if we're going to use this Dahrendorf or neo-Weberian perspective, then no, it doesn't matter that I own it. It matters who's making the decisions that make things happen. So in this environment, the upper level management who makes decisions end up being much more important than a simple Marxist view would allow for. Okay. Now this last little bit here is Bourdieu. Now Bourdieu was a French sociologist, and he wrote all the way up until like the 80s, and I think he was still alive in the 90s. He might have made it to the 2000s. He's a very recent sociologist, and he ended up talking a lot about capital that wasn't economic capital. That's Marx. He ended up talking a lot about cultural capital, and from that you can also talk about social capital. But cultural capital, according to Bourdieu, is all the stuff that comes with coming in different classes. Okay, so when you hear someone say that the ACT or the SAT is biased towards the upper middle classes because it's using languages and examples that appeals to the upper middle class, that's kind of what you're getting at here. If you have a kid that's born here and a kid that's born here that have the same IQ, but this kid does not live in a world where he or she gets to see yachts, right, and boats, then our questions on the ACT asking about yachting really helpful questions, right? And part of what they're getting at is that the upper middle class kid is going to have cultural capital that's more useful to succeeding at those kinds of games. All right. Now, at a shallow level, that could be stuff like, do you know enough to be able to talk fancy wines, or be able to talk a little bit of opera, right, in the right environment? And there is a whole group of people for whom the discussion of, or the understanding of, let me rephrase that. There is a whole group of people for whom going to college, this is the point, right? You want to be able to be broadly minded enough, educated enough that you can have a flexible conversation with people in a variety of different environments, because sometimes that's what you really need, okay? At a deeper level, though, you'll notice that cultural capital is cultural capital is measuring something else. When people talk about work ethic, I often wonder if that's not a coded conversation for different sorts of things, right? But if you're in the kind of family that doesn't have steady employment, I'm thinking of Honey Boo Boo, right? When that show first came on, everyone in the house would sleep till 12 or 1 in the morning, or 12 or 1 in the afternoon, and the reason was because nobody had to be anywhere except the guy, right? The guy had to be at work, and he was constantly falling asleep during filming. Why? Well, probably because he had to get up at 5 a.m. and go to work. But the rest of them aren't learning any sorts of quote-unquote work ethic things because they just don't have to. And how could someone like Mama June actually teach them to show up on time every day for a 7 o'clock job. I mean, I hope you don't think I'm picking on them, but when you listen to people who have to hire complaining about the folks that show up to work, you'll notice a lot of it's this cultural capital sorts of stuff. Do they show up on time? All the time. Do they do what they're asked without whining? Are they able to work quickly, right? And or do they move like slow molasses on a cold day because they feel like they're getting exploited? That ability to show up and be a good worker may be something that's programmed into middle-class kids in a way that it's not for kids whose family have sporadic employment. And that doesn't mean that the kid whose family has sporadic employment can't learn that stuff, but it does mean when he or she shows up at their first job at 20 years old with right upside someone else who's already learned it, the manager, if that kid's ever going to learn that stuff, the manager has to take the time to teach it, and that kid has to be open to learning about it. But you can also notice the same thing when you start thinking about how people think about money, right? Maybe a middle-class kid goes to work, gets a paycheck, pays her bills, and feels good about herself. And isn't that wonderful? But an upper-class kid isn't going to think about money as, this is what I need to get by to survive, and if I could make a little bit more, wouldn't that be awesome? Why can't I make a little bit more? Maybe the upper-class kid thinks about money more like someone thinks about a score in a game. And because the upper-class kid has never had to really suffer want, maybe he or she thinks about money in more risky ways. Like, sure, we'll go ahead and take a gamble on this opportunity, and if it doesn't pan out, that's fine. You know, the middle-class kid isn't necessarily going to take that gamble, because if it doesn't pan out, he or she won't be fine. I'm not saying these differences are necessarily real, but I am showing examples of how cultural differences could be stacked on socioeconomics. How cultural differences could correlate with socioeconomic differences in ways that you might not necessarily see. Yeah, that's good enough. And then social capital is essentially just a Bourdieu's way of talking about what you and I would call networking. And where are you likely to get a job opportunity? Well, you're not going to get it from your rich dad. Even rich kids don't get it from rich dads. You're likely to get it from someone in your network. Now, if you are so criminal that your network is full of drug dealers and gangsters, then guess what job opportunities are going to come through your grapevine, come through your network, right? If your network includes lots of people who are significantly tied into the corporations with money, then guess where you're going to hear of job opportunities, right? It's going to come through your grapevine from people who are at the top. We might say in a lay understanding that it's not what you know, it's who you know, and that's what social capital actually is. And the more connections you have, the stronger a thing is. In a neighborhood where everyone knows each other, where everyone passes each other on the street, on their way to the coffee shop and then to the subway stop, that neighborhood is much more robust, much more tightly knit together than one where you don't know your neighbors' names, because when you wake up in the morning, you go out, get in your car, open the garage door, drive away, maybe you wave, but you don't know who they are. You go to work, and then you come back home and you drive right up, open your garage door, drive in, and go down. That neighborhood isn't robust. Which neighborhood do you want to be in when there's a flood or a fire? Well, you want to be in the first one, because there are going to be more connections to actually help you survive and thrive in a bad situation than in the second one. In the second one, there's no connections whatsoever. Even if the number of people is the same, the capital, the social capital in the tightly integrated network is much stronger than the capital in the very weakly integrated neighborhood. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, thank you.